Hello and welcome to Haunted Montreal's Spooky Story Sessions. I'm your host, Holly Rhiannon, and today I'm going to tell you all about the old Saint-Antoine Cholera Cemetery. With over 200 documented ghost stories, Montreal is the most haunted city in Canada, if not all of North America. Haunted Montreal is dedicated to researching these paranormal tales, and our channel brings you videos in both French and English every second Saturday. Today's episode examines Dorchester Square and Place du Canada, popular parks in the heart of downtown Montreal, which harbor a very dark secret. Lurking just below the soil are the skeletons of an estimated 70,000 Montrealers, many of them victims of cholera, who were buried in mass graves during epidemics in the mid-1800s. But before we get into today's story, please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell button so you get notified every time we have a new tale to share. And hey, if you're already subscribed, thank you so much. Welcome back. It's great to see you again. Now, without further ado, let's get spooky. Dorchester Square and Place du Canada, popular parks in the heart of downtown Montreal, harbor a very dark secret. Lurking just below the soil are skeletons of an estimated 70,000 Montrealers, many of them victims of cholera, who were buried there in mass graves during epidemics in the mid-1800s. Once known as the Saint-Antoine Cemetery, the Catholic burial ground operated from 1799 until 1855 when it ran out of space. Rife with paranormal activity, the old Saint-Antoine Cemetery is a largely forgotten and yet haunted stain on the city's urban fabric. Firstly, after dark, the atmosphere of the cemetery changes, and a lot of people have reported feeling nervous and uncomfortable after sundown. For those daring enough to stay in the burial ground, there have been reports of strange shapes moving about, mysterious mists, and floating orbs in the treetops. On occasion, ghostly apparitions have been spotted wandering the cemetery, and in what is almost certainly cases of residual hauntings, the disembodied voices of muffled prayer and moaning can still be heard, not to mention sudden screams of agony that sometimes pierce the cemetery. The disturbing screams tend to occur in the southwest corner of the Dorchester Square portion of the old cemetery. To understand why these voices of the dead are still making a commotion, it is important to understand the horrible history of the old Saint-Antoine Cemetery. Early in the city's history, bodies were buried inside the fortifications in what is now Old Montreal. However, when the British took over the city in 1760, public officials claimed that more burials would endanger public health. As such, new locations were sought for both the Catholic and Protestant cemeteries. A large plot of land was bought for £1,500 in what was then a rural area. Named Saint-Antoine Cemetery, it catered to its Catholic residents. It was also known as the Cholera Cemetery, owing to 5 epidemics that struck starting in 1832. The first time the disease struck the city, Montreal was thoroughly devastated. On June 9, 1832, an immigrant ship called the Voyageur arrived in the Montreal harbor. As the passengers disembarked and moved into the city, it soon became clear that one man had been left behind. He was found lying on his back on the ship's deck, twitching in a state of pain and agony. He was attended by Dr. Nelson, Montreal's health commissioner. The diagnosis was clear. The man's blood had turned black, meaning that cholera had descended on Montreal, an extremely deadly and contagious disease. The disease spread like wildfire, and as the cholera spread through the city, its victims began to multiply drastically. Dr. Nelson oversaw the efforts to quell the disease. He ordered barrels of tar to be lit on fire throughout the city to try and purify the air, and he put all medical personnel on alert. Death carts began rolling through the streets with yellow flags fluttering to warn of the dangers of contagion. Gravediggers called out, "Have you any dead? Have you anyone to send to the burial ground?" The bodies were collected, put into rough coffins, 2 to 4 per cart, and then carted to Saint-Antoine Cemetery, where they were piled in stacks. There was no attempt to separate men and women, and no records were kept, largely because the gravediggers were all illiterate. With the rapid spread of the disease, it was soon impossible to bury the dead quickly enough. Only 3 days after the first case, more than 150 coffins were stacked in Saint-Antoine cemetery, and the gravediggers could no longer cope with Dr. Nelson's orders to bury each body within 6 hours. When Dr. Nelson threatened to burn the grim pile of corpses to ward off the disease, the Sulpician priests ordered their parishioners to bring their shovels and spades to the cemetery to help with the gruesome task. Trenches were dug 8 feet deep, 10 feet wide, and over 100 feet long. Crude coffins were stacked in the trenches and quickly covered with soil to try and stop the spread of the disease. The mood in the city was understandably depressing, and one recent immigrant named Mrs. Susanna Moodle wrote, "The sullen toll of the death bell, the exposure to ready-made coffins in the undertaker's windows, and the oft-recurring notice placarded on the walls of funerals furnished at such and such a place, at cheapest rate and shortest notice, painfully reminded us at every turning of the street that death was everywhere, perhaps lurking in our path." Doctors were taken off guard by cholera because they had never seen anything like it. Medical science was still in its infancy, and most doctors subscribed to or invented theories about how best to treat diseases. There was no consensus on how to treat cholera, but the use of opium, bleeding, and bed rest were seen as infallible by Dr. Nelson. Performing autopsies was considered the best way to learn about diseases, and medical students often resorted to grave robbing to obtain corpses for their anatomy classrooms because it was very difficult to meet supply otherwise. With the cholera epidemic in full swing, there was no shortage of bodies to cut open and study. To take advantage of the situation, the doctors set up sheds directly in the cemetery in the southwest corner of today's Dorchester Square to conduct autopsies and perform other operations. People began to describe the doctors as overzealous and deranged, and it wasn't long before indignant newspaper editors began to describe the sheds as slaughterhouses. Montreal's Catholic citizens asked their priests to intervene, make the autopsies stop, but instead, the priests joined the doctors in the cemetery sheds to help perform a very rare and unusual operation. Pregnant women who were nearing death would often beg the doctors to perform an operation known as an infant baptism. Because the Catholic faith insisted on baptism to enter heaven, these women hoped that their fetuses could receive salvation to join them in paradise. However, the only way to do this was to perform a cesarean operation in order to expose the unborn baby, at which point a priest could baptize it. The devoted women would scream in pain and agony as the doctors cut open their bellies, revealing the fetus. Priests would then sprinkle holy water into the open womb before both mother and unborn child perished. Overall, the doctors, with the help of a midwife named Madame Tavernier, carried out around 30 of these so-called infant baptisms in the cemetery. There is speculation whenever someone hears the disembodied voices moaning in pain or screaming in agony that it is the spirits of these faithful women who insisted on being ripped open before death to try and obtain salvation for their unborn children. On the other side of René Lévesque Boulevard, which bisects the cemetery, allowing daily traffic to roll over the dead, Place du Canada has many similar paranormal activities. These include strange orbs floating through the treetops, mumbling prayer noises, and the occasional wandering apparition. Place du Canada is also interesting because there are an above-average number of medical emergencies in the park, especially near the statue of John A. Macdonald. It is one of the city's busiest places for ambulances to tend to victims of panic attacks, shortness of breath, heart attacks, strokes, and other similar ailments. Many people believe that the statue is haunted, its eyes following people as an additional macabre element in a cemetery rife with paranormal activity. One especially haunted part is the road to the east, Rue de la Cathédrale, which used to be called Cemetery Street. In 1832, it was a corpse lane that led from the cemetery to Saint-Antoine Street down the hill. One warm summer night at around 2 a.m., a police officer patrolling on Saint-Antoine Street saw what appeared to be a corpse stumbling towards him. It was wrapped only in a winding sheet, as the burial garments were called in the era. The corpse had turned off Cemetery Street and was rambling along eastwards towards the city. Terrified, the officer ran back to the station in a state of absolute panic, gasping to his superior officer that the dead are coming out of their graves. In another macabre case, workmen were digging a ditch alongside Cemetery Street several decades after the 1832 cholera epidemic, and they came across a coffin that appeared to have sustained some damage. The circumstances behind the tale begin on June 26, 1832. A certain adolescent girl named Mademoiselle Hervieux decided to visit her best friend, Mademoiselle de Beaujeu, at her home of 320 Notre Dame Street in what is now Old Montreal. The master of the house, Seigneur Saveuse de Beaujeu, had died of cholera on June 15th, and most of the family were at his seigneury to try and escape the disease. His daughter, Mademoiselle de Beaujeu, and 2 servants remained at the house. Mademoiselle de Beaujeu had been feeling depressed, and Mademoiselle Hervieux was hoping to cheer her up with a cup of tea and some conversation. However, after just 2 hours in the Beaujeu household, at 10 p.m., Mademoiselle Hervieux began to feel rather unwell. Perhaps the servants didn't air out the house well enough. Mademoiselle Hervieux began to feel hot flashes, followed by cold, shivering chills. Then she began to cough, heave, and vomit. Finally, she began to feel a strong pain and her body began to prostrate and twitch, the classic symptoms of cholera. Because Mademoiselle came from a wealthy family, they decided to hire a doctor to see if there was anything that could be done for her. She was attended to by Dr. Arnoldi, the first president of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Lower Canada, and by 2 or 3 gentlemen night watchers. The first thing Dr. Arnoldi did was prescribe a large blue opium pill. If the patient could hold down the opium, the heaving often stopped, allowing the doctor to operate. Mademoiselle Hervieux held down the opium, and soon her mind drifted far, far away. The doctor then began probing her, looking for bad blood, the black stuff. He bled her by making small incisions into her veins with his scalpel. He then reached into his leech jar and affixed the small blood-sucking creatures to Mademoiselle's puncture wounds to extract the blood. After removing 30 ounces of polluted blood, the doctor noted how cool and clammy Mademoiselle was to the touch. That's when he heated up 2 hot laundry irons, which he promenaded down each side of the spine and back in order to reheat her body and reanimate her. Unfortunately, it appeared as though the operation was unsuccessful. Mademoiselle Hervieux was declared dead at daylight the following morning, June 27th. Mademoiselle's family were very upset, and the idea of burying her dignified body anonymously in a mass grave was all a bit too much. They decided to bribe the gravedigger a substantial amount to place her body in a crude wood coffin bearing her name and to deposit it into the side of Saint-Antoine cemetery with a wooden cross to mark the spot. A death cart was ordered for Mademoiselle, and she was buried in haste, still in her dress and jewelry. The next part of the story has been described as a bit disturbing. One of the problems that sometimes arrived was gruesome. Not everyone who ended up in Saint-Antoine cemetery was actually dead. Some of them were merely incapacitated from large doses of opium. For the luckier ones, when they woke up inside a coffin piled in a stack waiting to be buried, they could be saved by banging on the side to alert the gravediggers. However, not everyone was so lucky. Some of the victims woke up in crude coffins already buried under the earth itself. Such was the case with Mademoiselle Hervieux. The workers noted that the coffin had sustained some damages. Indeed, Mademoiselle had used her left elbow to smash a hole in the side of the coffin. Her left arm was extended out into the soil. By now, it was in a skeletal state. Inside the coffin, Mademoiselle's right arm was no longer in the standard funeral position. For some reason, Mademoiselle's right arm had snaked its way upwards towards her face, and she spent her final hours gnawing away on her wrist. The ditch diggers speculated that perhaps she got hungry, waiting all alone underground. Returning to that earlier story, the stumbling corpse that had so terrified the policeman was actually a fellow named Bill Collins, who had been mispronounced as dead because the opium had induced a coma. Mr. Collins was fortunate enough to wake up before being buried because a new trench was to be dug in the morning. His coffin was on the top of the stack, and he had pulled himself out and ran back towards the city, dressed only in his burial shroud. While he may have given the officer the fright of his life that warm night in 1832, Mr. Collins went on to live to a ripe, healthy old age of 92. In that truly horrible summer, cholera killed off almost 15% of the city's residents. 1,900 of Montreal's citizens perished out of a city with just 27,000 people in it at the time. To make matters worse, cholera epidemics would nail the city 5 more times in the coming decades, keeping the gravediggers very busy and causing the cemetery to fill up very quickly. By the 1850s, the cemetery was almost full. It had expanded across both today's Peel and Metcalfe streets and contained an estimate of more than 70,000 bodies. On July 31st, 1853, history repeated itself as a committee formed to choose a location for a new cemetery. In 1854, land was purchased near the toll gate on Côte-de-Neige Road on the western slope of Mount Royal, and in 1853, the Catholic Notre-Dame-de-Neige Cemetery was opened. Saint-Antoine Cemetery received its last body for burial in 1855, then began to fall into a state of dilapidation. Wooden crosses began to rot as weeds started choking the old burial ground. The abandoned corpse house with its creepy inscription on the folding door, "Aujourd'hui pour moi, demain pour vous," was soon defaced with lewd graffiti. Eventually, the city decided that the land was too valuable not to be repurposed. The remaining crosses, tombstones, and the corpse house were removed and the land was divided into plots for sale. To prepare the land being sold, corpses were dug up in the crudest of manners as workers smashed apart the coffins and shoveled the remains and coffin boards into jumbled piles on carts. There were some indignant protests at the way the dead were being treated. Others feared unearthing the dead could lead to disaster. In 1866, Dr. Nelson published his thoughts and gruesome observations about the deadly epidemics in a book called Asiatic Cholera, Its Origin and Spread in Asia, Africa, and Europe, Introduction into America through Canada, Remote and Proximate Causes, Symptoms, and Pathology, and the various modes of treatment analyzed. This may have influenced Dr. Philip Pearsall Carpenter, head of the Sanitary Association of Canada, to lead a campaign to stop the exhumations, claiming it could trigger another cholera epidemic, as it had done in London and Bristol. Work was halted in the summer of 1867, but resumed after only a few months. By 1869, Dr. Carpenter had persuaded the city to expropriate the cemetery for use as a public park. Victory was only achieved after a petition was filed, signed by many of the city's most prominent residents. The land was sodden, trees were planted, pathways laid out, and the cemetery was rechristened Dominion Square. Every effort was made to forget about the tens of thousands of corpses lying just below the ground. Dominion Square was cut in half in 1969 when the southern square was renamed Place du Canada. After the death of René Lévesque in 1976, Dorchester Street was renamed after the famous politician. Hundreds of corpses lie beneath the teeming boulevard. Dominion Square was renamed Dorchester Square, doing away with an unpopular colonial name. More recently, the parks were refurbished. In 2009, the city budgeted millions of dollars to start sprucing up the two squares. After finishing Dorchester Square at a cost of $9 million, the Place du Canada renovation was put on hold for a time in 2012 after officials suspected mafia involvement in the work. The work involved refurbishing old monuments, improving lighting and landscaping, and laying granite pathways. The city has a policy when skeletons are unearthed during work. Human remains are reburied at the Catholic Cemetery on Mount Royal. The city also decided to inscribe something special into the granite pathways to mark the dead. Forgetting the old cemetery had proven difficult, if not impossible. Today, those passing through the parks who look at the ground will see Latin crosses inscribed into the granite pathways. These crosses discreetly commemorate the tens of thousands of skeletons lying just below the ground, many of them still stacked in numerous burial trenches. The fact that so many people died tragically there either before or after their burials is one of the main reasons the old Saint-Antoine Cholera Cemetery is said to be so haunted. Are you a Montreal resident or perhaps a tourist who has had something strange happen to you at Dorchester Square or Place du Canada? If so, we would love to hear it. As always, we want to know your theories about what could be going on. Thank you so much for stopping by. If it's your first video, we hope you'll stick around for the next one. We post new videos every second Saturday. If you'd like to learn more about the organization founded by the talented Donovan King, it's all listed in the description down below, along with links to purchase tickets to in-person haunted storytelling experiences. Please remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'll have a new video for you in a couple weeks, but until then, stay spooky.